Awesome. Okay, I'll get started while people are still funneling through here. And welcome everyone to PACE's webinar, What Should We Say to Gen Z? This is part of our Civic Language Perceptions Project. Some of you have been on this journey with us over the last couple of months. Some of you, this will be the first time you're peeking into our research. So we've designed this hour for everyone to be able to really look into our research with us as we try to understand Gen Z's relationship with civic language. If I haven't met you yet, I'm Amy McIsaac. I am the Managing Director of Learning and Experimentation at PACE. I'm joined today by my colleagues Siri Erickson, Kevin Singer, and Bhumika Shah, all members of the PACE team, who you'll see showing up in chat. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to them. Just a couple housekeeping items at the top. I wanted to let you know we did not design a Q&A into this session. We have two guests who are going to be kind of sharing their perspectives of the data as we go. We did that intentionally with hopes that the chat can be the place where we are having rich conversation and exchange of ideas. So go ahead and pull up that chat and have that ready. If that is interesting to you, we hope you do engage that way. Siri and I will be doing our jobs to manage the chat while the other one is talking, so bear with us as we kind of toggle between the two roles. And then there will be a very brief poll at the end for quick questions, one of which is what other research related to Gen Z and civic language are you interested in? So that'll be a real place where we'd love to mine and harvest from you all how this conversation and topic relates to your work and if there's other analysis you'd be interested in us pulling. So just wanted to make sure you guys knew that was available. But just to get us started, we're going to do a 3-part warm-up. First, what I'd love to do is just get a thumbs up from anybody who's on this webinar who is Gen Z, considers themselves part of the generation Zoomer, Gen Z. Give us a thumbs up and let us know if you are Gen Z. We'll give a moment. Awesome. Seeing some thumbs go up. Good. We are going to really rely on the voice and hope that there's a lot of engagement in the chat from our friends who are in the Gen Z group. And so please don't be shy during this hour together. Now to get everyone involved, what I wanted to do is show you guys, these are the 21 terms. We'll be looking at them more closely throughout this hour together. These are the 21 terms that we surveyed the American public on their impressions and perceptions of. So why don't you just let your eyes kind of fall on these words. They're in alphabetical order. And what I'd love to do is ask in the chat if you could put what you think at this moment, before we go into the data, what you would guess is Gen Z's most positive word from this list. Just pick one. Go ahead and put it in the chat. I want to see kind of where energy sits, predictive energy sits on what Gen Z thinks is a positive term from this list. Freedom, equality, belonging, service, social justice, racial equity. Cool. Some of you got it right, but we'll be learning more later about that. What do you think is Gen Z's most negative word from this list? Which word do you think they ranked most negative? Patriotism from Lindsay, patriotism, republic, unity. Seems like there's a general theme of patriotism, bipartisan. Awesome. Okay, and then lastly, as we warm up, what do you think is their most unfamiliar word? The word that they indicated they don't know very well. Bridging. Republic. Civic engagement. Interesting, Reese. Yeah, liberty. All right. So we're seeing some consensus around some of these words. So we wanted you to kind of settle into the words a little bit and settle into a Gen Z mind frame as we go into the words themselves. And to help us do that further, We have two folks who are going to run alongside our data today and share their takeaways and kind of what's surprising them as we go. I'd love to invite Amar Peterman, who is the founder of Scholarship for Religion and Society and on the team at Interfaith America and was part of PACE's Faith and in Democracy Learning community. And also Wilfred Chirinos, who works with Generation Citizen, which is a group that focuses on civic ed for young people. Amar, I'd love to start with you and just take a couple minutes. And as a member of Gen Z, what is your overall perception of civic language? So words like democracy, civic engagement, racial equity, those words we just looked at. What's your overall perception of them, Amar?
Yeah, absolutely. When I first hear and see this kind of civic language invoked, my first response is honestly skepticism. I think I could offer intellectual and philosophical reasoning for that, but I think the fundamental reason is that in my lived experience, the people who employ this word or these words and these kind of ideas often fail to live up to the values that are inherent within them. I think language and more specifically, what our words mean is deeply contingent on the people who employ them and the places that they're employed. And that's evidenced in the very language of the study that it's a language perceptions project, that language isn't static, it's dynamic and it's very contextual. And so, there is a theoretical definition for a term like racial equity that we'd find in our textbooks. But what racial equity means on the ground looks very different if it is a brown Gen Z student using that language, or if it's perhaps a white university president. And that's not even to turn a phrase like racial equity into an idea, like fighting for racial equity. Um, I think skepticism is common among Gen Z because their most meaningful political formation has happened after 2016. Those from older generations, even young millennials, can often appeal to, in something of a nostalgic way, a time when America was not so divided across political and cultural and economic and social lines. But for Gen Z, this is the only reality that we know of our political life, where politicians elevate their own personal platforms on social media, where apps like TikTok capture current events through first-person videos, where factions of America fuse together nationalism and faith and act violently out of that combination. This is the reality that Gen Z know for American democracy and political life. But that's also why Gen Z have an incredible awareness to injustice and wrongdoing and abuse and corruption. And in return, I think that's why Gen Z are holding our nation and its leaders accountable to the high standard of these words like freedom and justice and democracy. And so for that reason, my skepticism around these words is coupled somewhat paradoxically with a meaningful hope that we can actually achieve the fullness of what these concepts and ideas mean, and that we can eventually perceive them all in a deeply positive way because the context and the connotation of them is towards ends that are constructive and meaningful and good for the flourishing of our communities. And so these two words together, skepticism and hope, I suppose kind of define my overall perception to civic language.
Thank you, Amar. It's really poignant. Wilfred, would love to hear from you. What's your overall perception of civic language?
Sure, yeah, I'm gonna do my best to try to follow that up. I wholeheartedly agree with what Amar said, especially on the skepticism. And I think Gen Z is a very value and action driven generation. And I think we're very cautious of terms that feel too idealistic or are very vague or jargony. So you see words like democracy often get thrown around. And I think that there's generally a shared understanding of what that means to be live in a functional democracy. But the word functions more as a verb rather than an adjective, right? Like democracy is something in action that we're actively participating in, as opposed just being passive observers. I have the benefit of being able to work in this space, so I'm lucky to be informed on what these terms mean. But I think with words like civic engagement, those fall very well into like the jargony section. in which it kind of has to be followed with examples of what that looks like in practice and in real time. Into the racial equity terms, you know, and Amar touched on this really eloquently, but you know, we're a generation that has witnessed virtually in real time and has lived through a series of reckonings with race in the United States. So we have a keen understanding of why racial equity is important in our civic lives, particularly in this moment. And so similarly with words like patriotism, right? These words have gained somewhat of a political charge that serve as signs for ideological alignment. So it's tricky to kind of have to walk that line and really say what you mean when you're using these words. So I think that there's a need to kind of demystify what some of these words mean and strip away what the assumptions that are placed on them. But as for my overall assumptions, or kind of how I see those words and view those words, I think there's just a disconnect between what those words mean ideally and what they look like in practice.
Love that point, Wilfred. Appreciate it. Great. Well, we'll be hearing from Amar and Wilfred a few times as we go through the data. And to kick us off, I'm going to turn to my colleague, Siri.
Hey everybody, great to be here, great to see you. So just by way of introducing you to this body of research, and if you're not familiar with PACE, we are a philanthropic laboratory for funders, and our focus together with our funders is to maximize impact on democracy and civic life in America. You can see some other stats about our org there, but we'll continue on. Next slide. So we've been on this language journey for about three series, I would say. So 3 cycles, I guess is a better word. 3 cycles of administering surveys to registered voters across the United States. So in 2019, we started this journey, and we were really just trying to understand initially, how can we understand the ways in which civic terms are becoming problematic in different ways. And then we did a larger survey in 2021 where we did a deeper dive into trying to understand, you know, what's happening with these terms. Is there a disconnect between the field of philanthropy and those that work in the democracy space and the rest of America? And we thought we might be done there, but there was just so much interesting data and we wanted to continue our journey. And so we did another administration of a slightly different version of the survey in 2023, really diving into the coded and loaded nature of civic terms and trying to get underneath the why of Americans' perceptions around these civic terms. Our project timeline, you can see here, we're right in the middle of the project. So one of the things that we like to do with our data is to actually share it and make it available to anyone who wants to look at it. So we're right in the middle of that timeline. We've released our data. We're doing a series of webinars, roadshow. There's a free interactive dashboard people can access and all kinds of things. So we are on a sense-making journey with y'all and everybody else who's engaging with us. And then later this summer and looking into the early fall, we'll be actually releasing a report with some of our key findings. But those findings aren't just going to be informed by us, but by all of the people who have engaged with us along the way. These are the terms, as you saw before. We clustered them into these 3 groupings. So we had 7 democracy terms, 7 civic engagement terms, and 7 racial equity terms. Each survey respondent got one of those 3 clusters. And the terms in bold are terms that we repeated from 2021. So we have some longitudinal data to share with you looking at those at 2 different snapshots in time. And then you can see the different demographics that we also asked in our survey. Again, the ones in bold are ones that we repeated from 2021. And I definitely do want to point out that everyone in our survey in 21 and 23 were registered voters. So that's an important detail to keep in mind as we look at the data. our survey had a lot of different kinds of questions on them in order to help us understand these 6 aspects of American voters' perceptions of civic terms. So we asked people about their impression of these 21 terms, whether they're positive, negative, unfamiliar, or neutral. And then for each cluster, so people got their cluster of 7, we asked them, which of the 7 are you the most positive on and why, and which are you the most negative on and why? And we have some really interesting data we're going to share about that. And we also asked them how these terms are motivating them in terms of connecting them to civic action. We asked them who they think the terms are meant for. Are they meant for themselves, people like them, people who are different from them? And then we asked about the unifying potential of the terms, whether they see these as terms that bring people together or drive them apart.
Sorry, I was having trouble getting off mute, which is such a rookie move. Thank you, Siri, for bringing us through the context that then brings us into the analysis itself. So let's get into the meat of it all. First, to give you guys a glimpse into the Gen Z sample that we're going to be looking at most predominantly through these next few slides. I think we're all here because we are members of Gen Z, or we are working closely with Gen Z, or have at least some basic knowledge. But just in case, Gen Z is defined by folks born between 1996 and 2010. So they are today's 14 to 28-year-olds, folks in high school, folks in their early 20s, and into the early adulthood. We have, I think Amar and Wilfred did a great job sharing some of what has shaped this generation, most notably the digital age and how much technology has been not only in their lives, but really central in their lives. Of course, the heightened climate anxiety as climate has changed around them throughout their life, and of course, COVID-19 as a global event. We had about 300, well, we had exactly 319, a little over 300 Gen Zers in our 5,000 respondent sample. And so it's about 6% of our national survey. What we do think is important to name is that for the purposes of the analysis here today, we have pulled out the 18 to 24-year-old group and called that Gen Z. There was another group, 25 to 34, but it was going to be a whole thing to try to pull out just the Gen Z from that 10-year span. So when we say Gen Z, we're really looking at the 18 to 24-year-old version of the 14 to 28 larger definition of that term. So just want folks to know that's the slice of Gen Z, but really kind of right in the middle of the Gen Z generation. That was repetitive. So we feel like it's a good representation. And of those 319 folks who are in our sample set, what we have on this graph in the yellow bar graphs are the demographic breakdowns. So our Gen Z survey respondents by gender at the top right here, the top left, are tipping a little bit closer, a little bit further into the female category than the male. By community type, we see the highest percentage of Gen Z survey respondents in our survey were suburban. Political ideology underneath them, we see the highest percentage was moderate, and then the combined somewhat liberal and liberal, and then the combined somewhat conservative and conservative. Top right, we see that we're looking at mostly English speakers. This is true for our sample set overall of the 5,000, but also true for the Gen Z look. And then what I think is really important to note is that the diversity representation by race and ethnicity is very different than the national picture. You know, nationally, the census says we're about 75% white only. We see that only at 42% in this breakdown. So we are looking at a more diverse group as we go through the data. So the first thing we want to show you all is the snapshot, the highest snapshot of where Gen Z is on their impressions of the words. So on the left side, you have the words, all the 21 terms, and they're in order of most positive to least positive. The purple bars are showing you the term's positivity rate, the orange bars their negativity, gray is their neutrality, and then yellow is their unfamiliarity. And so we see that for those of you that guessed freedom as their most positive word, you were the right ones. Freedom is their most positive term. This is also the most positive term in our national sample set, which we'll look at in a minute. But that's where we top out here. We also see some pretty big yellow bars. So that's the unfamiliarity when we look at the bottom of this graph. So things like civic engagement, and then most notably bridging and bipartisan. So overall, I think the storyline for me, if I zoom out a little bit, is we're seeing mostly purple here, so mostly positivity. And I think that storyline can often get lost with young people, where we forget that on the whole, positivity is the highest impression they have of the words overall. We do see, I think, a pretty considerable neutral representation here, which could mean that they are fully neutral. It means they don't really know how they feel about the word yet. It means they might be thinking about it still. Maybe they've never heard about it in a way that they felt like they could have an association with. But there is, I think, a pretty significant neutral picture and storyline here. Another way to look at this is to zoom out even a little bit further back. And instead of looking deeper into this data, I would actually encourage you to look at the patterns as you sit back from your computer a little bit. The top is showing you the exact graph we just looked at together. So Gen Z's impressions overall. And below it, you see the 5,000 person nation. That's the full sample set. And you can really see kind of differences in patterns when you do that zoom out exercise. We see less positivity with Gen Z than we do the nation. Nation, we're looking at freedom was at 87% positive, Gen Z was at 81%. So while the words are more or less in a similar pattern as you go top to bottom for both sample sets, we see more positivity for the big sample set than Gen Z. One thing that also sticks out to me when I zoom out here is the negativity pattern is pretty similar. We're not seeing a ton of negativity in Gen Z compared to what we were seeing in the national picture. So I think that's very interesting and possibly even encouraging that Gen Z isn't at a place of like outsized negativity on the language represented here. We do see the more neutrality, that gray zone is a little bit bigger in the Gen Z graph than the national graph. And then, of course, I think what pops out to me kind of first and foremost when I see this is how much more yellow there is in the Gen Z group than there is in the national picture. So they're telling us higher unfamiliarity with these terms. So this next graph is looking at net positivity, which is positivity minus negativity. So we're really getting a more distilled picture. And the orange dot is showing you where Gen Z falls in net positivity for the terms. And the purple dot is showing you everyone who's not in that category. So anyone over the age of 24. So what we take away from looking at it this way is that about 75%, about 3/4 of the terms, Gen Z is less positive than everyone else on the term. There are 6 terms where Gen Z is more positive than everyone else. So we're looking at unity as one of them. We're looking at equality, diversity, advocacy is a dead even, which I think is very interesting, social justice, and racial equity. So sensing a theme here, right? The words where Gen Z is more net positive than everyone else does tend to be in these terms that are associated with racial equity, equality, diversity, social justice. So I think there's a theme starting to emerge for us here for sure. Another way to look at this, so what you're looking at here is net positivity for each of the age cohorts along the bottom. You're seeing the words in alphabetical order along the side, and you're seeing the net positivity rate in each of these cells. What we've done then is highlighted which group was the highest net positivity for each word in orange. And so what you can see here is in the 18 to 24 column, the Gen Z column all the way to the left, they really lead the pack. They lead all the age cohorts in their net positivity on the word social justice and unity. We see some age cohorts aren't leading the pack in any words. I fall into one of those categories as a millennial, so we have some work to do. But then the older groups too, we see a lot more of the highest net positivities falling in folks who are 65 and older. couple more slides before we take a break. We know this is a lot for brains to take in, but we did want to show, as Siri had mentioned, when folks got their cluster of words, they were asked, which one word are you most positive on? And which one word are you most negative on? And so it was kind of a forced choice to really bubble up, where are we most positive and negative? And so on the left side here, you're seeing how Gen Z scored those. And on the right side, you're seeing how everyone else did. The orange bars are showing you the words that Gen Z and everyone else said was their most negative, and the purple bar is showing you which was their most positive. And so we see then Gen Z said their most negative term was patriotism. For those of you who selected that in our warm-up, you got that one right. Their most positive words are freedom, and then community is a pretty close second here. So I think it deserves a shout out. One of the other trends on this graph that I think is really interesting is that there seems to be, consensus isn't the word, but like a theme and kind of alignment with Gen Z. So where Gen Z is positive, like freedom and community, we saw low negativity. And where negativity was higher, we saw relatively lower positivity. So they really are kind of moving together in the ways that they're seeing these words as either positive or negative. And we do see, you know, pretty big extremes there in terms of selection. Now let's look at why, but don't get overwhelmed by this. I'm not expecting that you can even read this. What I want you to see is some patterns, and then I'm going to do some call outs in that white spot in the bottom. But what I want you to know here is that not after folks were given the options of which word is your most negative, they then were offered a slate of options to select why that might be true. And what's important to note is the options that were presented to them for why they might be negative were the inverse of the options presented to them of why they might be positive. So for example, it's like, which of these words is your most negative? I select patriotism. Why? And then some options like the media portrays this in a negative light. And then if I selected why is positive, it'd be like the media portrays this in a positive light. This word makes me feel fearful about the future. This word makes me feel hopeful about the future. This word is aligned with my personal values. This word is not aligned with my personal values. So what I think is important to note is that there was a kind of set number of reasons why we offered, and they could select, a respondent could select the inverse for each one. So I think where we see that that isn't happening is really notable and interesting. So here are some words I wanted us to look at intentionally today. So patriotism was the word that Gen Z told us they were most negative on. Well, why? For folks who said it was their most negative word, we see that the reason they selected that word as their most negative was because of their confidence in using the term, which is really interesting. If you were on our webinar, the last one we did, should we say patriotism? We saw that the national sample set as a whole, the reason that they were selecting patriotism as their most negative was more about the people they associated with using it. So Gen Z is saying a different story. I actually don't feel confident using this term, which I think is really interesting. Freedom was their most positive word. So why are they most positive on this word? And they indicate to us the experiences of this term is why they're positive on it. And also its alignment with their personal values. I think it's also notable when I look at this, their confidence in using the term freedom was actually more a selected option for why they were negative on it than patriotism was. So there's something interesting happening there. Community was that other word that showed up as one of the most positive for Gen Z. And again, trying to understand the storyline underneath that, we see that the friends and family and the way friends, family, and community are portraying the term community is having a very positive impact for young people, as well as seeing this word as in personal values alignment for them. I think it's also interesting, while we're just trying to look at it from the positive point of view, I do see pretty significant bars for feelings about the future. Feeling fearful about the future is a reason people selected community as a negative word, and then the people that they thought of when they thought of the word community. So I think there's some interesting storylines there that probably merit some further probing. Also wanted to look at social justice, because we saw that of that big graph we looked at, it was where Gen Z led the pack in net positivity. And it looks like they're most positive on this because of their confidence using the term, which I I feel like is great news as somebody who, I will be vulnerable, I still don't know how confident I am in using the term social justice. So Gen Z saying this is a word we feel confident with and confident using, I think is a huge feather in our caps collectively as a society. So I feel really encouraged by that one. And then also noticing how much media and the politicians' portrayal is shaping Gen Z's relationship to negativity of this word social justice feels notable for me here as well. Unity was the other one where Gen Z led the pack. And here we see that they are favorable towards that word because of their experience of the term, which is awesome. And then we couldn't do this webinar's pace if we didn't look at the word democracy, just to see what was going on there for Gen Z. And we see that the media and the politicians' portrayal of the term democracy seems to be contributing to young people's negativity of this word. And then the way that this term aligns with their personal values was contributing to the positive feelings towards this word. So I think that's good news. The positive alignment around personal values, I think, is really cool to see. All right, last thing we wanted to show you before we take a little bit of a breather here and let the heads settle for a minute. But what we really wanted to name too was that, as Siri mentioned, we did this survey 2 years ago in 2021. I guess it's 3 years ago at this point, but it was exactly 2 years before we were in the field with this survey in 2023, 2 years to the date. And so what we were able to do is we retested 11 words and we could see the overall positivity in 2021 on these terms and then 2023. And we were shocked when we found this headline kind of initially, right when we pulled the survey out from the field, because I don't know what we expected. I think we expected a little bit of holding steady, maybe some declines in some areas. But overall, we saw increases in positivity in 2 years of these terms. Unity and diversity are the two terms on this list that didn't make a huge gain. They're very close to or within our margin of error, so we're calling them holding steady, but the other 9 terms went up in positivity and in some pretty significant gains, right? We saw liberty almost a 20-point gain here, actually exactly a 20-point gain. So an interesting storyline that we had been sitting with, and we've been doing this level of sub-story investigation to say, are there groups that are actually driving that positivity more than other groups? So to be clear, every group is contributing to the overall positivity increase that we have investigated thus far. This is still a bit of a work in progress, but some groups are doing a little bit more than the national average, and some are doing a little bit less. And we see young people as one of the groups that there's a 15 percentage point increase when we look at young people's positivity on those terms in 2021 to 2023. I do want to flag, we in 21 bucketed 18 to 34, so we did that again in 23. So a slightly different age cohort than just exclusively Gen Z, but that group is majority Gen Z. And we're seeing them being one of the groups that really is responsible for the increase in those 2 years. So a lot of hypotheses flying around about this increase, about what might be going on to contribute and really think about that increase. But this storyline is really emerging for us as we're digging into it all as really interesting and something we're going to think a lot more about. So with that, let's take a minute. Let's take a little breather. I'd love to turn back to our two speakers and get your takes on what surprised you. And this time, let's start with Wilfred. Wilfred, what that we just went through stuck out to you? What's kind of surprising you from all of that?
Yeah, there were a few things that stood out to me. And then I know that there's a difference in terms of there's still a noticeable difference between the Gen Z and the national averages of perceptions on the phrases. But I think still just how the trends are generally aligned with one another, especially to your point on the negativity end as well. I thought that was fairly surprising, just because, it does cut against a current narrative that Gen Z is so ideologically different from other generations. Like does seem to be some consistency between the two. I was really surprised that terms like civic engagement and bipartisanship were more positive. But I think that does speak to the kind of idealistic jargony portion that causes caution. As I mentioned earlier, I thought it was interesting that bipartisanship was one of the most unfamiliar terms I'm not sure what that says about, like, what our generation has witnessed in our democracy, that we're not necessarily sure what bipartisanship looks like, or can't necessarily say that we're familiar with it. But I think that's just interesting to note, especially, at a time where bipartisanship seems like the only way that things can kind of get done. And then I think it also caught my eye how close Gen Z was with other generations in terms of the terms of community and freedom. I think when we I know I'm sure we're going to get into it later. But when we start to look for those words that kind of are bridging words, or words that kind of cut across generations, or resonate with several generations, those seem to be terms that are the ones that resonate with everyone.
Which terms bridge across generations? That's a great research question for us to go into. So I love that. I'm just taking a note. Amar, what about you? What surprised you from what we saw?
Yeah, like Wilfred, I was surprised by the amount of Gen Z who were unfamiliar or neutral in regard to the language of bipartisan and also bridging. I think, if we want to see the words that Gen Z perceive positively, like unity and freedom and community, we want to see those actualized, then I think that Gen Z, at least at a base level, need to know what concepts like bridging and bipartisan are, let alone hopefully hold them in something of a positive light. I'm also somewhat surprised to see a term like liberty with such a high positive perception, and even more that it had the largest net increase since 2021. I would have imagined it still being somewhere closer to where it was then, and around 57%. And so I'm also curious what factors drove that increase over the past handful of years. And then lastly, I'm also surprised that the word American only had a 54% positive perception among Gen Z. I think it's really significant that 46% of Gen Z would have a neutral or a negative perception of the word American. And yeah, there's a lot of ramifications of what that might mean for us.
Yeah, really very insightful. Thanks, Amar. Let's turn it over to Siri, who's going to bring us into some other elements of our research.
Yeah, great. So we asked a lot of other kinds of questions related to these terms. So in this slide, you're seeing the terms that Gen Z compared to everyone who's not Gen Z think bring people together. And really here the storyline is that Gen Z, this is a theme we keep coming back to, are more likely than other generations to see that equity cluster of terms bringing people together. I think that's a clear trend here. And that's in contrast to the democracy word cluster terms. So Gen Z is less likely to think that terms like democracy and citizen and American are bringing people together. So we see some clear trends there that are consistent with some of the themes that we've already been mentioning. Here's another kind of look at that bringing together as compared to driving apart. And here you're just looking at two responses. So we're looking at people who said it brings people together a lot and people who said it drives people apart a lot. So the two extreme choices. And interestingly, I think we see that for Gen Z, there's a lot more feeling that these terms are bringing people together than that they're driving people apart a lot. So that's interesting. Community continues to be a top term here as by quite a bit, as one that brings people together a lot, and in this case, the most. We see, interestingly, racial equity, though 31% of Gen Z see it as bringing people together a lot. There still is a sizable number of people within Gen Z that see it as driving people apart. And that could be for different reasons. It could be just an astute awareness of how the term is operating and functioning in the US today. Could be other reasons as well. If we go down the list, I've also flagged patriotism because that is another theme that we're seeing with Gen Z. Not only are they not positive on the term, but they also see it as being quite divisive. It starts to be the first one where driving people apart a lot, that number is higher than bringing people together a lot. And then I flagged these three at the bottom, especially I think democracy is interesting, that the Gen Z perceives that democracy drives people apart a lot at a slightly higher percentage than it brings people together a lot. So that's kind of another interest. We're starting to see some trends in some of these words, even amongst the different questions. Here we're asking, which of these terms do you think are meant for you? And so you can see the options across the bottom. There were 5 choices. And again, we see a similar trend where Gen Z is a lot less likely than other generations to say that that democracy word cluster of terms are meant for them. And they're more likely on most of the equity words to say that they're for them more so than other generations. I also want to flag in that first top cluster, civic word cluster, that belonging is one where Gen Z actually does think is more for them also than other generations. Here we're looking at data from a question that we asked, who do you think democracy is working for? And these were all the options that people had. They could select more than one. So they could select the country as a whole and me, for example, in any combination. So this is the total number of people that selected each of these options. And really here, interesting, we're seeing Gen Z mostly tracking with the nation on these questions in terms of who they think American democracy is working for. Most people in our survey think it's working better for others than they do that it's working for themselves or people like them. The place where we see the biggest difference between Gen Z and those who are not Gen Z is whether democracy is working for the country as a whole. And there we see that Gen Z is 9 percentage points less certain that American democracy is working for the country as a whole. We also were trying to understand something about how these terms motivate people to engage in civic action. And so for that top cluster, those civic engagement terms, we asked, how did these each term motivate you to help others in your community? For the equity terms, we asked them, how are these terms motivating you to stand up for a cause that you care about? And for the democracy cluster of terms, we asked how these terms are motivating you to vote. And so again, we're seeing the same theme play out where the equity cluster of terms, we see Gen Z having a higher likelihood of saying that those terms are motivating them to stand up for a cause they care about. And then that's compared to the democracy cluster where we see Gen Z consistently less motivated by those terms than other generations for voting. The only one that maybe is pretty equal is freedom. Freedom is equally motivating for almost all Americans, it seems. Okay, so what should we say to Gen Z based on our data? This is just kind of a summary. So this is that chart that we saw at the top. And here is just kind of a summary of the themes that we've been seeing as we've moved along these different slides. So again, terms like freedom and community having strong positivity, and even freedom being the most positive for Gen Z as it is for the nation. Most negative, we're seeing that theme of patriotism. Motivation, words like freedom and community, again, are motivating. Terms that are meant for them. Again, community, we're seeing community is kind of popping up in a lot of these. Most unifying, community, equality, unity, and terms like that. So we're starting to see patterns across the different kinds of questions that terms that have strong positivity tend to also be terms that are motivating, that people feel like are meant for them, and that people perceive to be unifying. So we're starting to see some overlap between how the terms are functioning across these different questions.
Great. Thanks, Siri. And so that can feel like a lot, right? So you just got a lot of graphs, a lot of info, a lot of summary. So what do I actually say to Gen Z? We get asked that question the most in this project. What do I say? What do I say instead? What do I say to a particular group? What do I say if I'm trying to communicate X, Y, or Z? And so one of the things and one of the elements we knew we wanted to bring into this project was some resource, some tool to help people who are really in a place of stuck on how to talk about some of these elements so that people are hearing them the way they are hoping. If you're not familiar, Pluralytics is an AI platform that we've partnered with. And one of the reasons we partnered with them is because our data maps so closely to their data. And their data is informing a platform where you can input any piece of content. It can be a tweet, it can be a headline, it can be a 5-page report. And then you can say score, and that Pluralytics will score your content against different value segments, which is what you're seeing in that in the graphic there on the right. So instead of being like, will this content reach Republicans? Will this content reach Gen Z? It's saying no matter those kind of labels and boxes we've created for each other, there are value segments. There are ways people value different things in the world that create these segments where they will hear things a certain way. And we can find ways to communicate more effectively within those value segments. One of my favorite examples Pluralytics uses is the difference between give, donate, or contribute. So all of these things mean the same thing, right? You're trying to get somebody to open up their wallet and provide some resources to a cause. You can say give to our cause. You can say donate to our cause. You can say contribute to our cause. There are other ways to say it too. All of them have the same meaning. It's just that it's going to fall on different value segments' ears differently and kind of get them to do the thing you're hoping that they will do. Again, how do we get language out of the way so we can get our message through? And so we've partnered with Pluralytics in this project. We have about 50 seats. And so if you're interested in this tool, we'll have some instructions at the end about how to access it. But what I wanted to do for the purposes of like, what do we say to Gen Z? We have a benchmark that we've created with Pluralytics that optimizes things for Gen Z. So we can put in any content into the platform and say, does this hit Gen Z? And it'll score it as either yes or no hitting that benchmark. And then, and this is my favorite part, you can ask it to rewrite it so that it will optimize for Gen Z. And so we thought it would be fun to play around with this a little bit with you all. In the registration for this event, we asked folks, we were going to do a live demo. What do you guys want to hear? And the overwhelming request from registrants was, how do I talk about civic engagement with Gen Z? And so PACE has a civic engagement primer, right? People come to us with that question. What does civic engagement mean? We developed this primer. It lives on our website. And so I thought we would use ourselves as a guinea pig for what we might look at for this through a Gen Z lens. And so here's how we define it. Civic engagement is the process of helping people be active participants in building and strengthening their communities, whether defined as a place or a shared identity or interest. It's a spectrum of ways people can participate in self-governance, from interactions with government to voluntary associations and everything in between. So let's take a minute. I want to hear some predictions in the chat. Give me a yes if you think this is going to hit the Gen Z benchmark. Give me a no if you think it's not going to hit Gen Z benchmark. Do you think that this content, this definition of civic engagement, reaches Gen Z the way it's written? Give me a yes or no in the chat. Not a single person believes in this. Okay. Yeah. It doesn't. That's a big no for us here. It does not reach Gen Z. You all nailed it. But what we were able to do was do some rewrites. And you can have it rewrite as many times as you want. So you can really start to get a different options and then also start to see some takeaways emerge. I'm not going to read through each of these. But just to give you the shortcut of what I see here. So we said in our definition, civic engagement in the process of helping people, ... in all of the rewrites that we asked Pluralytics to do on that definition, not one of them said helping people. Helping people was stripped from the rewrites that were trying to optimize for Gen Z. We see phrases like empowering individuals, assisting individuals, building and enhancing communities. We don't see helping people. And I really noted that as it felt like there was a very subtle but very profound shift in the way the language was becoming parallel, becoming equal versus helping, which tends to have a power dynamic infused into that meaning. So that was really stripped out. We said civic engagement is the process of. There was no process showing up here. All of these definitions go right to the point. Civic engagement entails, civic engagement involves. It's just a lot more direct definitions and a direct language than what we had on our website. And then I thought it was really interesting too, the version we had on our primer, we really had an emphasis on shared identities. But in all of these definitions, AI is optimizing for Gen Z and asking us to focus more on shared connection and shared aspiration. So those are just some subtle things here. I mean, if you really sat with this, and you'll get the deck and follow-up if you really wanted to sit with this, but they all mean the same thing, and that is the point. We're not trying to change meaning. We're just trying to get language out of the way so the meaning can come through. And this is an example of how at least AI offers a suggestion for the way Gen Z may hear this definition of civic engagement more effectively. One other thing I thought we could do just to play around a little bit. So I thought we could do a Gen Z lightning round because I was just too interested to know how Gen Z thinks about certain things that we have come to know in the world. And so I'm going to ask you to be in your chat again and do some predicting with me. The first thing I did was I put the Pledge of Allegiance through Pluralytics, and I'm curious if in the chat you let me know, do you think the Pledge of Allegiance hits the Gen Z benchmark in Pluralytics? Give me a yes if you think it does, a no if no. No. I like some just laugh out loud. No. Yes, you guys got it. It does not hit the benchmark for Gen Z, but here's what the rewrite said. I vow my allegiance to the flag of the United States and to the republic it represents, a single nation under God, inseparable with freedom and equality for all. Really interesting that freedom and equality replace liberty and justice. That tracks very closely to the data that we looked at, right? How much freedom was embraced by Gen Z. So different, it lands on the ear slightly differently. Let's do two more. One is we've got JFK's quote, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Do you guys think it hits Gen Z, yes or no in the chat? Give me a sense of where you're at. Seeing a lot of no's and nah. This does not. You guys are right. You guys are very good at this. Here's what the rewrite says. Reflect on how you can make a difference for your country, not what it can provide for you. So here, I think there's a few subtleties that I take away, moving from ask to reflect, emphasis on making a difference. I will note that we ran this one for another demo we did where it did not hit for the rural. We have a rural benchmark as well. It doesn't hit for that. We do have a bridginess benchmark, which is this going to hit a diverse audience? Like, is it going to hit the value segments as a whole? And this quote does hit for bridginess, which might be why it has stood the test of time so effectively, as it really does kind of hit a lot of different value segments in the original way, ask not quote. Lastly, and yes, Maureen, I agree, these are not as catchy. AI needs a good communications director or something. But let's do one more. MLK Jr.'s quote, I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Do you think this hits for Gen Z? We see some folks, we got a yes in here. We're a little less certain about this one. closer. Okay, so this one does hit for Gen Z. You can always rewrite anything, whether it hits your benchmark or not. I didn't do a rewrite for this because it hits. So let's just call that a win for the day. Great. So with that, let's turn for the final time to our two speakers. And Amar, I'll start with you this time. I'm curious, as somebody who is Gen Z, who's been listening to this for the last hour or so, if you were to talk to someone about who is asking you the question, so what do I say to Gen Z? How would you respond?
Yeah, I think the snapshot slide comparing Gen Z positive perception against the national perception is really key. As you pointed out, when we broadly see a less positive response in general to the language that's surveyed, but what increases in Gen Z isn't the negative response, it's the unfamiliar and the neutral response. I think that signifies that there's a huge space for education and civic formation among Gen Z that can take place. And we also see that the words that bring people together for Gen Z are those that speak to their lived experience or our collective lived experience and the things that we aspire to: community, belonging, equality, justice, diversity. And so I would say in whatever you say to Gen Z, lead with your experience. If you want to have a conversation about the state of our democracy, don't open by saying John Locke says XYZ about democracy. Say, acknowledge your own experience and lead with transparency about your own social location and how and show genuine curiosity and willingness to enter into a two-way conversation. And if you're not ready for that, then perhaps it's not the best time to begin talking with Gen Z. And with that, I'd say lastly that should embrace the tried and true practice of listening. Listen to Gen Z who are many are in their first years of significant leadership in business and nonprofits and religious spaces. Obviously, right now, Gen Z are organizing across university campuses and trying to say something. And so listen to them, listen to Gen Z like Wilfred, who have worked and are currently working in our political system, Gen Z who are writing and speaking about the topics and challenges and questions that they're facing today. The knowledge and the formation that comes from these conversations, I think, are really the best way to enter into asking that question of what to say to Gen Z. I think the first step is to listen to what they're trying to say to you.
Thanks, Amar. Really appreciate that. Let's go to Wilfred. What would you say to somebody who's asking, so what do I say to Gen Z?
Yeah, Amar, I think you really hit the nail on the head with speaking to lived experience. I think the main piece of advice I would give to anybody who's curious, on how to communicate with folks in my generation is being real. I think that should be the main thing that's on your mind. There's really no hiding the ball from Gen Z. We're very acutely aware of what's going on. So I think it's important to acknowledge realities that students are facing, especially amidst a mental health crisis post-COVID. But in that same sense, right, I think it's important to communicate in the most direct and actionable terms, but with the tenor of hope, because I think that's what young people today are really looking for. Ways that they can take an active part in shaping their future that they want to see. A lot of surveys have shown that young people are very disillusioned with the current state of affairs. So being able to communicate with them in ways that show them that there is a path forward, that there's no need to just sit by and passively observe, but you are as much as part and have as much stake in the game as other folks as well. So yeah, just again, keep speaking to those lived experiences and being real. Meeting young people where they're at. I think that'd be my part of wisdom.
Awesome. Appreciate that. And I love that you named that, Wilfred. Like, there is so much narrative about how young people are negative on democracy and not interested in civics and political engagement. And our data and so much data out there also stands in the face of that. So I think holding up these areas of research, I think, are really, really key. We are just at the top of the hour, so we're going to go another 2 minutes just to wrap up. If you have to leave, no issues, but I'll turn it over to my colleague Siri to just bring us home.
Yeah, so we'd love to have you continue on this learning journey and sense-making journey with us. These are some upcoming webinars. Next up is Should We Say Racial Equity? So we're going to do a deep dive into what our data say, particularly about that term and the terms in that cluster. And then also following that, rural communities, and then closing out that series, really doing a deep dive at all the fascinating data we have about the term democracy. So join us for those. And then there's a whole slate of other ways you can engage with us, and all of them you can access on our website, pacefunders.org/language. So we encourage you to go there. You will find all of the things listed on this slide and much more on our website. So please do check that out and stay in touch with us. Amy has started a poll, so we hope you will jump in there and just answer a few questions for us before you leave. It's been a delight to share this time with you, and especially thanks to our guests, Wilfred and Amara. We're so glad that you were here with us to shed some light on this data and to make it real and to make it human. And so thank you for being with us today. Yeah, keep taking that poll. And Amy, back to you for the last word.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. We'll follow up via email with this deck, as well as a recap from this. So you'll have everything if you want to look at it again, and just lean on us as you have questions that are specific to Gen Z or really anything in our data. We're very available and eager to convert you all to the language nerds that we have become. So thank you again, Amar, Wilfred, and everyone for joining, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.